Well, oh my goodness gracious. Hello, hope. Whoa, I got to get used to this now. This is going to be interesting, having to speak and try to hold the mic at the same time. I have trouble walking and chewing gum at the same time, so we'll see if I can manage this. In any case, hope all of you have had coffee, lest I run the risk, or roll the risk, I guess, of putting you to sleep. Be that as it may, I will press on. What I'm going to be talking about has to do with common objections from atheists. I think the title of this talk was answering the atheists on the street. Now, whether you have to go out and find these people in streets or in chat rooms as I did, or in your university classrooms or at your workplace, wherever, should you encounter them, you're likely to find them offering the sorts of slogans that I'm going to discuss. And I initially, as I mentioned yesterday, or at least I think I mentioned yesterday, I initially encountered these sorts of things in the context of attempting to share the gospel in chat rooms. I would go in there and look for every sort of non-Christian I could find, and had all sorts of interesting discussions. And in the course of those discussions, I found the same sorts of objections and slogans being brought up again and again. And so what I'm going to attempt to do now is to discuss 5 of these. Now, I was just informed before getting up here that the time slot for this has been shortened, so I'll have to go a tad more quickly, but that's all for the best. Now, there are many different categories into which these sorts of things fall, but what you will find, especially today, is that our culture is dominated by science. There's a perception that science can explain everything. And sometimes this is set within the context of a perceived conflict between science and religion. In fact, there was a book published, I think in the 1800s, titled A History of the Conflict Between Science and Religion. And there'll be talk of warfare between science and religion, and one could do a whole talk about this. In fact, I think Richard, in one of his many PDF decks, addresses these sorts of things in more detail. So I refer you to that if you want to look at this in some more depth. However, you might wonder, is there anything that we can say quickly to address this idea that science can explain everything, and thus there's nothing left for God to explain? This is the sort of claim that will be made. They'll say, science can explain everything. In fact, science has been increasingly successful in explaining things that were once thought to be explained by God, or at least so the claim goes. And so what can we say with respect to this? I think, helpfully, what Richard said in his talk just before this points out exactly the flaw in this kind of reasoning, that what science doesn't explain, most fundamentally, is existence itself. Science presupposes existence. It doesn't attempt even to explain existence. And if we can perceive, as I think we can, through a consideration of a thing's essence and its existence, if we can perceive that those things are distinct and that, therefore, an external cause is required in the beings whose essence is distinct from their existence, then what we can conclude with is a being whose essence is existence, and this, as Aquinas might say, we all know to be God. And so what we can see then is that science doesn't explain the most fundamental thing in reality, that is existence itself. And there are, in fact, many other things that science doesn't even attempt to explain, and we can expand on those things a bit later during our Q&A time if you wish. But since time is pressing, I will press on. You will also sometimes hear the claim from atheists, particularly in a debating sort of context. They'll say, atheism isn't a belief. It's just a lack of belief. It's the lack of belief in God. And the reason atheists will make this sort of claim is because they want to avoid what's called the burden of proof. They want to avoid any sense that they need to actually argue for the things that they say. I say, well, I'm not making any claims. I'm just saying that I lack belief in God. You believe in God, so you need to give arguments to justify your belief. I don't have to give any arguments to justify my belief because, in fact, I'm not making a claim. I'm not stating a belief at all. I'm merely stating the lack of a belief. And here I think we can point out a couple different things. First of all, this is not historically how atheism has been defined, and I could give you numerous sources for that, as could Richard. Many of these are given in his PDF deck, the title of which I believe is Answering Popular Atheism, or something to that effect. You'll be able to find it on his website, and he gives many quotes from atheists, both contemporary and, I was going to say ancient, I guess that's not very complimentary, less contemporary sources that specify this, that atheism is in fact the belief that God does not exist. It's not a lack of belief, it is in fact the belief that God does not exist. But what else can we say? One thing we could say is that if one defines atheism that way, then it doesn't even make any sense to say that atheism is true. Because beliefs are what are true. Lacks of belief aren't true. That doesn't even make any sense. And yet we'll find atheists, professing atheists, saying things like atheism is true. Atheism is the truth. Well, if atheism is true, it's got to be a belief. The belief, namely, that God doesn't exist, not merely the lack of belief. Thirdly, however, we can see that this is a mistake because it leaves out what you might think of as the default position, which is not a lack of belief or a denial of belief in God, but it would be a suspension of judgment. If one hasn't considered the issue in any depth or any detail, then it seems like that's the attitude with which one ought to start, would be a suspension of judgment. And this is normally thought of to be agnosticism. If somebody says they're an agnostic, it means they haven't decided whether they think God exists. But if you say that anyone who lacks a belief in God is an atheist, then there's no difference, there's no way to draw a distinction between an atheist and an agnostic. And so you end up sort of muddying the waters. Ultimately, though, I think all of this is sort of just debate about words. Thankfully, we have, as we've seen already, hopefully, extremely good reason to believe that God exists. And so I'm happy in most of these contexts to let the atheists call themselves whatever they want, describe themselves however they want. The important question that they have to confront is, do they have an answer to the sorts of arguments that Richard gave in his earlier talk? I, in fact, don't think that they do. But often you will find them saying things like, he who asserts must prove. The one making the claim has to prove what they're saying, and since they merely lack belief and they're not making any claims, they don't have to prove anything. Of course, what have they forgotten? He who asserts must prove is itself an assertion. And so then they need to prove that. And they don't ever bother to do that. If you think you've got to prove every claim that you make, you're going to have an infinite regress, which is to say you're going to have an infinite number of claims that you need to end up proving. And so this is just a road down which no one should wish to go. And so we can talk a bit more about that later in the Q&A if any questions come up about that sort of thing. But those kind of issues having to do with definitions and who has the burden of proof and that kind of thing, while they can be interesting and while they can be worth thinking about in some context, ultimately it seems to me the more important issue is, what are the reasons to believe that God exists? Are those reasons good? And if they are, what has the atheist to say in response? Thirdly, you'll sometimes hear people say extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And they'll say the claim that God exists or that Jesus rose from the dead is an extraordinary claim, and so you need to provide extraordinary evidence that this is true. And then they never tell you exactly what they mean by extraordinary, but they say whatever you've got doesn't rise to that level, and so we can all go home. And despite my attempts to actually get people to specify what they mean by extraordinary, they have nothing to say. And so I think this highlights something that's important to keep in mind. Often, these quips, as I have said, are just slogans, which means people haven't really thought about them. They've heard them, and these people have judged that they sound effective or they sound persuasive, but they haven't given them a whole lot of thought. And so in many cases, it's necessary only to probe them a little bit and to ask what some of the terms mean, and then you'll see that the individual who's used the slogan hasn't actually considered what it means and may not actually have any idea what it means. But even on a merely intuitive level, this claim seems to be false. If you take extraordinary, for example, to mean something that doesn't usually happen, something out of the ordinary, as the term extraordinary seems to indicate. For example, it would be an extraordinary claim if I claimed to have won the lottery. Do y'all have lotteries in South Africa? I should know these sorts of things, shouldn't I? That would seem like an extraordinary claim. In fact, the probability that that would happen is astronomically low. And yet, if I were to tell you that I won the lottery, what sort of evidence would be required for you to believe me? Well, all I would have to do is specify what the winning numbers were, perhaps produce the ticket that has the winning numbers on them, and that would suffice. But of course, that's rather ordinary evidence. Lottery tickets aren't extraordinary. There's nothing extraordinary about the sequences of numbers that appear on lottery tickets. That's all sort of run-of-the-mill type stuff. And so on the basis of ordinary evidence, evidence that could be easily produced, evidence that's not miraculous or supernatural or spectacular or grandiose or whatever, on the basis of that ordinary evidence, you can be led to believe that an extraordinary claim is true. So I think what this highlights is that what's relevant is whether we have good evidence to believe the things we say. And we shouldn't worry about any sort of slogans regarding extraordinary claims or extraordinary evidence, because the terms are not defined very clearly at all, and they seem to be subject to these sorts of easy counterexamples like what I've given here, the example of the lottery ticket. That's an ordinary kind of evidence that can be produced to show that that extraordinary claim is true. If in fact I have won the lottery, I can merely produce the winning ticket, and on the basis of that ordinary evidence, you can come to believe the truth of the extraordinary claim. Now, the fourth claim that I'm going to discuss, I think, is a bit trickier. It can sometimes be laden with a lot more emotion. In fact, I remember my own brother presenting this challenge to me. He, at this point, is not yet a believer, and I feel like every time I meet with him, every time I see him, in fact, we have the same conversation. Often it goes well into the wee hours of the morning, sometimes all night, and he'll say the same sorts of things. He'll say, well, it seems like you've got an answer for all this stuff. In fact, I think eventually I will believe, but I just can't yet. And why shouldn't God just appear to me? If God exists, he could snap his metaphorical fingers and show up and put an end to all this. He could settle the debate once and for all, and yet there's all this diversity of religions such that you have to go around giving talks about these things. Why is it all so confusing? Why are people so confused? Such that apologetics is necessary. Why do you have to go around to conferences like this? Why is it all buried in books in the library that most people don't know about? Most of your church people don't even know about this stuff. That's why he's talking to me. That's why you got to go around and tell people about this, because most people don't know about it. Why would that be the case? If the evidence were so great, if it was all so easily available, if it was as decisive as you say it is, why isn't it more widely known? Why wouldn't God ensure that people had access to it? At least the people who wanted it. Why would it even be necessary to go trawling through all these books and to learn about arguments and to go get PDF decks off of websites and think about them? Why is all that required? If God just wants a relationship with us, with anyone who's willing, well, God knows who's willing. Why doesn't he just appear? He's done it before. He appeared to the Apostle Paul, so you say, and that was it. He showed up, Paul surrendered, and the rest is history. Why couldn't he do that to me? Why wouldn't he do that to everyone like Paul, everyone who would bend the knee were he given the opportunity? Why doesn't God show up to all of those people? And I think this is a much more interesting, much more difficult question. And thankfully, I think the Gospels itself provide some clues as to the answer. For example, in Mark chapter 4, I think it's verses 10 through 12, and this is in some of the other Gospels as well, the disciples come to Jesus and they say, "Why do you speak in parables?" And I think in some sense they're giving a version of the same question. Why do you speak in such an obscure way? If all this stuff is as important as you're saying, why isn't it made clearer? And Jesus gives them a very interesting answer. He quotes from Isaiah chapter 6. I think it's verses 9 and following. And he says that he speaks in parables so that they won't understand him. And you're like, well, why would he be doing that? Why would Jesus go out of his way to obscure the truth of his own message? The truth of the good news, the only news by which we can be saved. Why would Jesus obscure the truth of that message? We see the same sort of thing talked about in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 11 and 12. God says that on those who won't believe the truth, he'll send a strong delusion so that they would believe a lie. Why would God do that sort of thing? In the Old Testament, we have God sending lying spirits to deceive people. What's that about? And I think reflecting on this question can reveal something very interesting. Jesus says elsewhere in the Gospels, he says, "To whom much is given, much is required." And so I think we can see what's going on here. that when Jesus obscures the truth of his message, when God, through various means, obscures the truth of his message to someone, he's doing it out of his mercy and out of his love toward them. Because suppose people that God knows would reject the good news were it offered to them. Suppose those people were given a clear revelation of the truth and then said no. Well, now they're liable to greater judgment, and they've committed a greater sin because they've seen God clearly and rejected him. But if God sort of mumbles while speaking to them, and they reject that, then they've still rejected God, and they can be judged on the basis of their wickedness, and God knows their heart. But they haven't sinned as grievously because they haven't rejected as clear a message. And so I think in some of these cases, God deliberately obscures the truth of what he's saying precisely because he doesn't want to make some of these people any more guilty than they need to be. He can't make them believe, but he can spare them from committing a greater sin than they would otherwise commit. And so why doesn't God show up to everyone? Well, I think we can say he doesn't show up to some people because there are some people who would reject him if he showed up. And this, in fact, happened. Jesus was told by some of the religious leaders that he was casting out demons by the power of Satan. The work of the Holy Spirit was manifest before their very eyes, and they attributed his miracles to Satan. I once heard a story of a Muslim individual who had interaction with some Christian missionaries. I forget exactly where this was. And I'm told, at least, that when he had the gospel proclaimed to him, he said, yeah, I know this Jesus. He's appeared to me in dreams. But I can't accept him. I won't accept him. Now, you might wonder, does this contradict what I've just said? Jesus is now appearing to people who are rejecting him. I hold out hope, though, that he's appearing to this fellow because he's working on him gradually. And hopefully this individual will be brought to faith. As I said, this is merely a story that I heard, but it is testimony that sometimes even people who have visions of Jesus say no. And if that's true, and if God knows who those people are going to be, then why would he appear to those people? Why would he bring them under greater condemnation? Because we can reasonably infer, I think, from other passages in the Gospels. For example, Matthew chapter 11, I believe Jesus is pronouncing, verse 22, I think it is, and following, he's pronouncing judgment on various towns, and he says it will be more tolerable for Sodom and Gomorrah than for you on the day of judgment. And I think what that indicates to us is that not all condemnation is equal, as strange as that might sound. Some people, though they will be separated from God, will face a worse judgment than other people, and God, in his mercy and in his love, wants to spare people, I think, what he can. And so, I think, sometimes he chooses to obscure the truth of what he's saying and to not appear to those that he knows would reject them. And you might say, well, why doesn't he then appear to everyone that he knows would accept them? Well, suppose he did that, Suppose this was so frequent now, his doing this, that it became so widespread now, that word of these sorts of stories began to sort of leak out and began to become known even to those who would reject Christ. And now, as a result of this continued and mounting testimony of the visions of Jesus, even the people who would reject Christ are now faced with mounting and accumulating evidence. Well, if God is trying to spare those people that kind of evidence so that they don't incur a greater condemnation, then that could explain why he doesn't show up to even those people that he knows would accept him. And what do we find? We find Hebrews chapter 11, for example, verse 6, saying that God is a rewarder of those who earnestly seek him. We find, for example, in Matthew chapter 7, this is reiterated in verses 7 through 9, that those who seek shall find. To those who knock, the door will be opened. To those who ask, it will be given. Jesus says in John chapter 6, verse 37, that whoever comes to me, I will in no wise cast out. Anyone who genuinely is willing to seek God, that person will find God. But he does have his reasons for not appearing just to anyone who might want him to on any given occasion. He is God, after all. He's not a puppet, and he's not someone to take lightly in that sort of way. And lastly, there's an objection you'll sometimes find among internet atheists. They'll say, well, I believe in one less God than you do. We're all atheists with respect to Thor and Zeus. And it's always Thor and Zeus. They never come up with other sorts of gods. And I just go one further. I just deny the existence of Yahweh. And as soon as you come to appreciate why it is that I reject the existence of all these other gods, then you'll come to see why I reject the existence of Yahweh. And I think here the best thing to do is to say, whether we should call you an atheist or not, technically that doesn't seem correct, but I don't want to worry so much about that. I want to flip it on its head. I want to say, as soon as you understand why I accept the existence of Yahweh, and you compare the evidence that can be given in his favor with the lack of evidence found in favor of any of these other beings, then you'll understand why I reject all of them while accepting the existence of Yahweh and his Son Christ the Savior. Would you like to hear the difference in the evidence? And then you're off and running, and you now have a platform upon which to present evidence for the truth of the gospel. And then if they say no, they're not interested in hearing what you have to say, then you say, well then, I don't need to bother with your objections if you're not actually interested in sifting through the evidence and taking the time and putting forth the effort to really think through these things. And I think what you can see, hopefully from what I've said, is that these really are just slogans. Now, by saying that they're slogans, I don't mean to say that anyone who uses them is somehow at fault. As I mentioned last night, at least I think I did, often people pick up their beliefs the way dogs pick up fleas. This is how I function. And Simon will no doubt inform you of fleas. Yes. That is just a joke for people who might be wondering, but he's always itching to make these jokes, you see. But I don't mean to suggest that we need to beat people up or think of people very poorly because they use these slogans. I think rather we should think of them as people who are, in some sense, victims of their environment, and we just need to wake them up. So you don't have to go through life surrendering your thoughts about what's most important to factors beyond your control. It doesn't have to be up to your culture or your upbringing or your social group or your parents. You can actually take some responsibility for the things that you think. And I need to do that too. We all do. And so you can sort of invite them to engage in this process with you. And hopefully we can sort of wake them up. Not just so that we can convince them that what we think is the truth, though ultimately I hope that's what happens, but so that we can get them off autopilot and help them to see that these things are far too important to let our beliefs about them be consigned to chance, but that we need to be deliberate about how we go through life, about how we go through the process by which our character gets developed, the process by which our thinking and habits of thought come to be. And if nothing else happens during this conference, I hope you will begin to get a sense of just how important this is, and this task that lies before all of us. And with that, much to Simon's delight, I will shut up.